The problem with autonomous weapons fundamentally is the problem of accountability. I think AI can be used to also detect disinformation and deepfakes, and there are plenty of companies out there that are doing it already.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. According to the World Economic Forum, by 2025, artificial intelligence, or AI, is expected to displace 85 million jobs, while simultaneously creating another 97 million jobs in its place. Do you think this is true? How do you think society will adapt to this rapid transformation? In this episode, we are joined by first-time guest Evanna Hu. Evanna is the CEO of Omalus, a cutting-edge technology company that provides a real-time online information environment pertaining to security and influence threats. Evanna is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, specializing in the intersection of emerging technologies and national security. She is also part of the Aspen Global Leaders Network and has won numerous awards for her work in using tech for good. Evanna, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Evanna, in an article you wrote for the US Foreign Service Journal, June 2024 edition, you emphasized the need for a vision of how AI will be integrated into US democratic society. What specific elements should this vision include, and how can it address the concerns of both tech evangelists and decelerations?
That's a great question. I'm flattered that someone has actually read that article. um, but the reason why I wrote the article is because I felt like we were talking a lot about the tactical, right? On like how can we or what are some of the doomsday scenarios that people like to talk about, or even just like, should chat GPT be in schools without really talking about the direction that we want the society to go towards, right, into the future. And that really means talking about the values. Are we still talking about a society, especially in America, where we're having one of the most contentious elections, most polarizing elections? Um, do we still want this AI filled where AI enables society to hold the exact same values and morals, meaning the democratic ideals, right? And also talking about the freedom of expression and individualism? Or is this a right time to accelerate the conversation around whether or not we want to change certain values? And so I think it's really hard to talk about the tactical level stuff, like a specific tool, without better understanding or even having a conversation around, do we actually agree on the strategic direction or what we want the society to be?
So, Ivana, for our audience, and just to get this straight, would you consider yourself a tech evangelist?
Hmm. I don't, because I think the creation of technology is fundamentally political because people create technologies for power and for money, right? Think about all the tech giants. However, the technology is only there to enable what we wanted to do. So, in that sense, technology is neutral until we decide whether or not we want to use it for good or if we want to weaponize it for malign uses.
Look, just hearing what you say makes me think that nothing in the tech world will necessarily lead us to a utopia. Because if it's true what you say, namely that it's all about power and profit, I don't think that there's one human endeavor that has turned out well when that was the key motivation. So, in terms of that, how do you see things being publicly acceptable. I mean, are we just like the great unwashed out there where the tech giants just, innovate and do whatever they do in isolation of everyone else? And it's just a lay down misere. It's okay, this is the technology Facebook's come out with. You're going to have to use it because we're going to make you dependent on it. It's kind of like a sort of almost like a similar sort of situation to how drugs affect society. You've got the pushers who then, give you the merchandise that you then get dependent on that you can't live without, and we can't move away, and nor do we have much of a say in what goes on.
I think two things. One is this might seem as a semantic and a significant point, but I think we differ in the way that we define power, because fundamentally a democracy is about giving power to the people, right? But it's still about power. So power can be leveraged and used and harnessed for good. So power does not have to be bad, where which sometimes we do have, there is a stigma, I think, attached to the word power. But if you we just take your metaphor that you brought up, and I think this is actually a very comparison, which is drugs, right? Even if you just take something like marijuana, it can be used for good. Medicinal marijuana is a thing. It's one of Canada's most profitable industry, but it can also be used for bad. And if you look at drugs in general, like a lot of people got addicted to opiates originally because they were initially subscribed for dulling pain, right? Which like we all need after surgery or whatever it is. So so this is where I think it's actually a great example of how yes, these drugs, the AI were created by these companies that want profit, where they somehow want to centralize power, but it really depends on how you use it. That is different. So technology is accelerating how quickly someone can get and accomplish their motive, right? And what they want to get out of using technology. But if we really want to change how technology is being used, we first have to question people's motives and change that. And that inherently is not a tech problem. That becomes one of the oldest human problems that we have.
Ivana, there is something quite bizarre in the way that things are structured these days. And look, I hate to blame the Americans for this, but I do blame you guys because you're the trendsetters in most things, either technology wise, social wise, so on and so forth. But when it comes down to it, we're living in a world of monopolies and duopolies and a concentration of power and wealth, the likes of which we've never seen in human history. So, what makes you think that democracy somehow can percolate upwards, that a company like Facebook or the Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs who seem to be doing their own thing and microdosing all the way to the bank, I'm just not sure how, when we talk about power, where the people come into all of this, because at the moment, from where I sit, and I'm sure most of the audience as well, we are the disempowered when it comes to technology. I mean, we are sitting down watching all of this news coming out at us, suggesting that there are going to be breakthroughs in robotics, that there are breakthroughs in all manner of AI, that Chat GTP, number 6 version, which will come out soon, is going to be a danger to humanity. With this sort of information, if you will, forgive me, but I think it's quite natural for people to be rather skeptical about a good outcome to any of this. Yeah.
And I think a part of it is we have to blame ourselves too, right? We complain about these technologies. We complain about the harms of social media, which I'm pretty sure everyone agrees with at this point. It doesn't matter what political party you come from, which part of the world, right? And yet we still use it. You and I probably have had conversations in the past about data privacy, and yet we're doing this on Zoom, right? And so there's a
Ironic, isn't
part of this complacency that we have, and we let them get away with it because we know that we're benefiting from it, because it's easy, because what they have done is they've given us the convenience. And a lot of people don't want to part where they are too tired or they have too many other things that they need to get done, that they don't want to look for alternatives, right? Alternatives to Zoom exist. There's Jitsi, there's a bunch of other things, but we don't use that. And so I think it's when people complain about the biases, for example, in ChatGPT or in the data, in the training data sets behind AI systems, right, that makes an algorithm racist. And that's the reason why policing algorithms, for example, are banned in many parts of the world. And we complain about it, and we should. But I think the real reason why we complain about it is because it holds a mirror to society, and he shows us the ills that we don't really want to think about.
Ivana, just on a more personal level, how did you get into this occupation? And, what made you found a company like Omalas to begin with?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been interested in tech, right? I think 20, 30 years ago, definitely my company would not have existed because no, we didn't have AI really to the same level that we had when we founded a company in 2017. Now, obviously, it has grown a lot, but I've always been really interested in what makes people tick, meaning at the time I was working a lot in countering violent extremism, which is how do we actually prevent people from joining terrorist and extremist groups, right? And I was very focused on Hezbollah, the Taliban, and ISIS. And it was the challenges, okay, like what are they reading online, and how, and that gets them to then go to an encrypted chat with these recruiters, then ultimately, ends up with a really nice girl from the middle of nowhere America or London, finding herself as a jihadi bride in Syria. Like, how does that happen on such a massive scale? And that is not too different from any sort of influence campaigns or even brands campaigns to get you to buy a pair of Nike shoes. Right. It's all about how do we foster this fake sense of community and loyalty to something that's frankly very superficial, right? Like a pair of shoes. But if you like your pair of Nikes, you're always going to go back and get the next version of those Nikes, and we all do it. So how can we, I was really interested in using technology to understand persuasion. And whereas I think a lot of extremist groups are, they're interested because they want to keep on recruiting people and keep on getting people to drink their Kool-Aid. I wanted to use that to find a way of how do we actually make this society more cohesive, which is a much harder problem because it's always easier to get people to adopt the us versus them mentality than trying to find a common ground and have a conversation with someone who might, at first glance be totally opposite from you and your history and your background and your values.
If you don't mind me asking, what is your observation about human nature, having looked at the darker side of things through your work?
So I want to talk about the positive, which is that fundamentally, I think everyone wants the same things, right? They want to be happy, whatever that means. They want to be healthy, and they want their kids to be better off than they are. And I think the ways of getting to those three things is very different. And that's why we have conflicts. But I think when you really distill it down to that, and then you understand the context in which they grew up and the context in which they find themselves in now, you start to realize, okay, like I can empathize with why that person is has done a terrible thing, right? Not sympathize, but I understand why. And I think that really unlocked a lot of conversations for me and the ability to sit across a room from a terrorist, and be able to still see the person as human, which think it's increasingly harder now for a lot of people to do.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, Ivana, if we go back to general technology, do you share the concerns expressed by some within the tech community that AI will grow to become our destroyer, or do you believe it will become our liberator and savior?
Yeah, I disagree with both camps because ultimately that's putting AI on this pedestal that it's going to have its own thinking and thoughts, and this like idea of a sentient AI, which I don't think we should ever get to because it's still fundamentally a machine. And something that we forget is that these machines are still coded by humans, right? So when something is being coded, that engineer or that developer's own biases also get encoded in, which is the reason why we're always talking about we need more diversity at the human level who are working in the AI space.
Can you explain to our audience something about the current deadlock in AI regulation on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C.? What strategies could be implemented to break this deadlock, and how can lawmakers find common ground between varying perspectives on AI integration?
Great question. I think number one, they need to be educated on the topic. The technical know-how is very sparse in this town. So that's number one. And then they kind of fake it, right? They do the fake it till you make it. And so then they're pretending like they know when they really don't. And so then they kind of just give it to their 23-year-old staffer to deal with. So that's a problem. And then the other problem is really just, I think, at a broader level for the more educated policymakers, it's this trade off of how can I have a set of regulations that will foster innovation and ideally responsible innovation while at the same time making sure that I'm not becoming an authoritarian state. And if you look at the US approach, which is free for all, the Wild West, versus the European approach, I don't think a lot of people can even name a single chatbot coming from the EU, even though they have a couple of amazing ones that have, raised a lot of money at a very high valuation. So
Sorry. I was just going to ask you. I mean, with regard to, the political lay of the land, what do you know are the policy differences between the Democrats and the Republicans on AI generally? Is there more bipartisanship between the two parties on this relatively controversial issue, or do we see that the two parties themselves are presenting to the American people two different futures?
yeah, I think the regulation of AI itself is nonpartisan. There are different approaches from both sides, but ultimately, I actually think it becomes the two camps are a little bit different. It's basically the moderates in the middle that can be both Republicans and Dems versus the extremists on both sides.
The AI has the potential to disrupt the world order significantly. How should the US approach the creation of international rules and norms for AI, especially considering the risk of bias, which you've mentioned earlier, and the potential misuse of autonomous systems in war? You've also mentioned just a moment ago the difference between the American approach and the European approach. Obviously, when we're talking about international rules and norms, we have to talk about a disaggregated space internationally where different countries are doing different things. Will this lead, therefore, to different outcomes globally?
Yes, I'm glad you asked a question about international norms because we obviously cannot avoid, talking about some of the more authoritarian countries and their own approaches and whether or not they actually want to opt in to the standards. There have been many conversations actually around basically the Geneva Convention, but for the use of AI. Right. So, for example, the how autonomous weapons should not be used, which clearly is not true in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. But the problem with autonomous weapons fundamentally is the problem of accountability. If a bunch of civilians got killed, who do you blame for that? Do you blame the guy that's like kind of the drone operator or the drone itself? Especially if it's autonomous, right? So it's harder to assign blame. So that's more of a tactical issue with it. But the broader question that you raised is: are we ever going to have a universal set of regulations on AI? I don't think we're ever going to come to one. However, just like nuclear weapons, there will be, I think, a red line that all the countries are going to have.
With regard to international rules, a thought just occurred to me, and that is, well, what happens if, say, for instance, the Russians or the Chinese, who are currently outside of the system, the Western system, decide to buy into a Western system? Say they decide to, sign up to the Europeans and their approach, or they sign up to the United States and its approach. Do you think that autocracies can corrupt the very essence of what we now take for granted in terms of our very loose understanding of regulatory authorities governing AI?
I mean, I think that's already happening. China and Russia have both been flexing their power and influence, especially soft influence, um, or over international organizations like the UN, and the ISA, for example, and all these other ones. And so they definitely know how to play the game and they know how to co-opt them, right? So instead of state capture, like how we talk about the Balkan countries, these straw men state capturing, right, the countries and turning them into their personal coffers. Um, they're basically doing the same thing, but trying to impose their own value systems. And so when it comes to tech, and this kind of goes back to, I think, a question from two or three maybe questions ago, but or threads ago. Um, I think the Western approach when it comes to tech has always been looking at horizontal integration and saying that that's an antitrust issue, and obviously the EU leads in a lot of that. But the authoritarian or the non-Western way, a lot of times is vertical integration. So it's much harder to detect, right? Because if China is going to own the rare earths plus the fiber optics and the undersea cables and the 5G and the LEOs, that is extremely hard to detect while they're happening, which is the reason why I don't think we caught up to what they were doing until 8, 9 years ago when we looked at it vertically. And so I do think that there is a difference in like how we think about systems, and my fear is that eventually these countries are going to catch up to what the West has been doing in terms of just the R&D capabilities of AI, and that they're very good at applying it.
Ivana, can you describe the tension between using AI for disinformation and censorship? How can democratic societies balance the use of AI to protect free speech while preventing the spread of harmful disinformation and deepfakes?
Great question. I always say that disinformation is not a new problem. A lot of people think that it is because we've been talking about it so much the past 10 years. But it's been around for as long as humans have been around. It was just called rumors back then. And deep fakes are basically a version of rumors that you probably heard from your grandmother, or the non-technical version. And so I don't think I think AI can be used to also detect disinformation and deepfakes, and there are plenty of companies out there that are doing it already. A lot of the tech giants are coming together to create essentially like a hash so that we know when something has been digitally manipulated. But fundamentally, it comes down to the consumers. And this is where we need people not only to be literate in media and in critical thinking and all these things, we need them to actually be educated on checking your sources and verifying. And right now we're not doing enough to even get to the literacy level, much less the educated level.
Okay, now to be completely cheeky about this thing, do you think that education has to start off in schools? Because, us adults of a certain age, I think we're relatively set in our ways. I think that we have our opinions and we won't change them readily. So, really, the only way that you're going to get people to understand the full scope of things that they need to with regard to AI, it needs to start from the ground up. It needs to start at primary school, secondary school, university. It's got to be a continuum all the way through. I don't see that happening. I mean, we talk a lot about it. We've got governments at the local level and at the federal level here in Australia, even talking about the whole Bill Clinton information superhighway thing as if it's a thing, and yet really putting their shoulder to the wheel and developing policy necessary to get that education happening is not happening.
I actually think that the antidote or what do they call it, the immunity shot, right, to disinformation that politicians like to talk about, it's actually an education problem, and you need to start in preschool. And if you look at countries like Finland and Estonia that have done an amazing job in terms of like inoculating their population against typically Russian maligned influence. I mean, they get a lot more of it than we do in the US and also you guys in Australia. But their people typically don't fall for them. And that's because they see it as an education problem going down to um, their version of kindergarten, and they teach that. Um, and they see it as a social welfare, right? They see it as, okay, so what makes you vulnerable to actually believing in it? And typically it's because of the lack of dignity, it's because of lack of community cohesion, or a secure family or community support. They look at that as, okay, this is something we need to deal with the Ministry of Social Affairs. It's a very different approach from everyone else who kind of sees this as a national security concern.
With regard to free speech, Ivana, is Elon Musk right in his approach to free speech?
I disagree with the way he runs X,
You're going to
and
get
I
into
think
trouble for
he
saying this.
has also realized that, right? Like if you read, man, what was the Steve, not Steve, well, the Walter Isaacson book, right? And he went into X wanting, 100% free speech, and then very quickly, once where his plane got doxxed by a Twitter account, he was like, "Oh no, we need to shut that down." And he realized, like, no, actually, this does not work. Um, so I mean, I think the American definition of freedom of expression given to us in the First Amendment is also can be seen as very extreme by all the other countries that don't have it, including the UK.
Yeah. Okay, so Ivana, what is the importance of public understanding and engagement in the development of AI policies? What steps can stakeholders take to ensure that the American public is informed and involved in discussions about AI's role in society. Now, we've mentioned education as being a pathway, but that hasn't been developed yet. So we're dealing with the raw clay of a generally ignorant public and, dare I say, a generally ignorant political elite. So where does this all go and how do we rectify this situation?
I mean, the elite are citizens too, right? And I think we should actually mandate it as just like how all have to pay taxes. We all probably should go vote. Not everyone does, but most people do. But everyone appears for jury duty, or else you can actually go to jail for that. And in the very much the same vein, we need to make education of media and civic duty a huge part of what we do, because I think it is on us to actually learn more about AI and these tech tools and be a part of the conversation. There are so many platforms to be on to have your voices heard. Problem that we often run into is that we don't get the right type of participation, meaning we get a lot of trolls but not anything that's significant and meaningful. And so if we can actually have that kind of civic discourse, that would also help the policymakers who they don't know that much more than we do, right? And we're expecting them to regulate something that is continuously improving and changing. And so a lot of times they're looking for solutions from the people because they don't have it.
That's true, but strategic communication, because it has to start from somewhere or someone leading the charge. I mean, it's more of an art than a science, and building a counter narrative to the nightmare AI scenarios that Hollywood has profited from over the years will be difficult, if not impossible, right?
I mean, I think there are also a lot of movies with feel good robots, or just the fact that there are fundamentally good uses of AI already embedded in the movies. And I think a lot of Japanese movies, for example, have always depicted bots and AI as friendlier than the ones coming out of Hollywood, right? So, but a lot of times we don't point them out because we're like, oh, that's cute. Or but what really sticks with you are the ones that, yeah, that invoke your negative emotions. And so I think a way of thinking about even, okay, how can we actually regulate it is actually to use that and say, you know what, I'm inspired by this movie and the movie's doomsday scenarios to learn more about this and to actually contact my congressman. So I actually think it can be used for good to get people more engaged.
Very interesting and refreshing perspective. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Washington, D.C., we're speaking with CEO of tech firm Omelas and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Evanna Hu. Evanna, how has Biden's CHIP Act affected the People's Republic of China's AI evolution? With no access to advanced semiconductors and high-end chips, will this force Beijing to adopt a different approach in its AI strategy?
Mm. So the sanctions actually have had limited effects. You can buy these chips on the black market relatively easily. And when I say black market, I really mean you can walk around the corner and get it literally off the street. So, but what it has done is it has made China go through all of its key tech sectors and basically prioritize, okay, how do we not be overly reliant on one single supplier or one single country who's not our ally? And so they poured a massive amount of money into creating their own semiconductor industry, into photonics, microelectronics, which are sort of the next version of semiconductors, if you will. And so they haven't caught up just yet, but the fact that it has made them essentially shift their strategy to make sure that they're not overly reliant on anything coming from the West, um, I think is probably something that the Biden administration did not um, forecast, because that has obviously escalated the tension between the two countries.
In our last episode with Dr. Alice Yang, we were talking about Taiwan and its centrality to the production of advanced semiconductors and chips. And we were also talking about Taiwan's relationship with China as a key provider of foreign direct investment to the People's Republic. How does Taiwan fit in all of this? I mean, if we're talking about the PRC and it trying to move its way out of the restrictions of Biden's CHIP Act, which you've just eloquently said aren't that restrictive, are there back channels into Taiwan that China can also leverage its position there to get what it needs to take the next intuitive leap in AI?
Yes, and China has already tried, right? It has tried through using this ethnic, like, well, we're all Chinese people kind of way, and and so that's sort of, I guess, the carrot, and then the stick has been IP theft and trying to get people who have originally worked at TSMC and Samsung, which are the two largest provider or producers of chips, to come and do joint ventures in Chengdu, all of that stuff, and it's very good at picking up people who have been passed over for promotion, for example, and then and giving them a sweet deal on the mainland. So it has tried all of these things, and it has not worked as much as as quickly as assume it was going to. Um, and I want to use the word quickly because China, because it's an autocracy, their timelines are a lot longer than the 2-year political cycles that we're used to. And so I think it might actually be effective. We're right on the effective this like journey for China, but we just don't know what those markers of success are, right? So I think it has already tried and it has not really worked. Um, I don't think it's actually going to like kinetically invade, but I do think that there's going to be a huge escalation in all the non-kinetic coercion ways.
Yes, that's what Alice and I were talking about, and I think that that's probably the future of our relations with the People's Republic. In terms of that other element of the axis of autocracies, Russia,
Mhm.
with regard to its international sanctions following on from the country's invasion of Ukraine, where do you see AI going in Russia? Do they have more of a hurdle than the Chinese to overcome? Or is it about the same? Will they still be able to get what they need from the black market? Or are there other impediments that will make the journey for Russia harder?
The biggest difference here is the fact that China has money and Russia does not.
Right.
So Russia does have its own AI strategy, but it doesn't have the money put behind it. So first of all, so that's the first thing. Secondly, human talent. There has been a huge brain drain, obviously, because of people trying to escape, conscription and military service, all of that. So a lot of the talent has already left the country.
What about that other element of the axis of autocracies? We hear ever so often of North Korea launching cyber attacks all over the place, and some of them have been rather effective. But when we look at North Korea, we tend to think of it as barely hanging on to anything. Okay, they can build ballistic missiles and they can conduct their cyber operations, but really they can barely feed their own people. So, how deep are North Korea's capabilities in terms of AI and the basis for, you know, modern 21st century tech?
Yeah, they're very sophisticated at ransomware and cyber attacks, mainly because they need the money. So for them, it's the biggest thing is money. They are still recuperating, if that's the right term, from COVID because they did not have the COVID vaccine, so they were locked down for 3 years. And so they are massively behind in terms of R&D, but not so much from the application. And this is where by putting more and more countries under sanction, what that basically means is that they're going to start their own party, right? All the sanctioned entities are going to come together. We saw Putin's friendship, with the North Korean leader, and also looping in Iran and China, and so they're all going to actually have they're going to start their own system. I think at BRICS last week they just announced that they're formally launching their version of SWIFT, right? Because it's through the SWIFT system that we are financially sanctioning these individuals and countries and organizations.
How far behind do you think the axis of autocracies is from the West in AI development? Would it be safe to assume we're winning this war if we can say that we're locked in a technology arms race with these countries?
I think depending on which aspect of AI and quantum and all these other emerging technology areas you're looking at, that mostly we are winning, but we're also losing in some. I think the Chinese test of hypersonics 2, 3 years ago was really a wake up call that China has been advancing their hypersonics, and we were caught off guard.
Returning to more local concerns, I mean, as AI technology rapidly advances and integrates into numerous sectors, what do you see as the most pressing challenges society faces in adapting to these changes? Are there particular areas where you think the impact will be most significant?
Oh, 100% upskilling jobs. I think this is the same as the automation wave that we experience where machines replace bank tellers, right? And so a lot of these quote unquote like lower end of white collar jobs are going to be replaced by automation and AI, whether that's like an actual bot or just an algorithm. So I'm very concerned about the Americans' ability to upskill, and I think the universities are, they're not necessarily the best solution for someone who's in their 30s or 40s looking for another career because they know for a fact that their jobs are going to be replaced in 5 years.
Yeah, that's a rather frightening situation. But also looking at it from a consumer perspective, I'm one of many millions of consumers at the bleeding edge of all this experimentation with technology. And I must say, I get rather miffed when things change and I have no say in how my bank operates, for instance. My bank has now decided to take out most of its ATMs, a drug I was actually quite used to. I could go to a local area not far from where I live, I could take my money out, and that was that. That was a convenience. Now we're, now in a so-called cashless society, which the banks are starting to create for us without asking us whether we want it. We're going to have to deal with the fact that we won't have cash much longer. And then we also have to deal with the fact that, banking is still a complex exercise, and ever so often you need to pick up a phone and speak to a human being. Now, with language models being as they are, there is an expectation by those people who are tech evangelists that all those bank clerks that are still left and who are still employed gainfully by their businesses, they're all going to be turfed in favor of much cheaper AI driven language models. But those models, as you rightly said earlier, they don't think, they can't think, they're not intelligent. So when I have a complex problem and I'm trying to explain it to a language model AI, and that AI just doesn't seem to understand anything that I'm telling it, my frustration level as a customer and a consumer goes through the roof. And I won't be the only one. There will be many millions of people saying, yes, okay, AI can develop, but does it have to replace everything?
I mean, the the capitalist answer to that is that eventually you're going to go with the bank that's going to offer you humans, whereas everyone else has automated it, right? It's almost like, what's that phone company now that essentially sells those dumb Nokia phones for like $150 because it's like, oh, there's no internet on this one. And you're like, I can literally go to Africa and buy this same kind of phone for $5 on the street. So I mean, I think, that's sort of like a sarcastic answer to your question. But I think ultimately it needs to be a conversation that everyone has. And I don't think there's a way of like they're looking at it from a cost cutting perspective, sure, but there's also that customer satisfaction level. And I think they are listening to the customers and they understand that even though they might replace every single ATM, they need to have at least one or two contingencies. And going off your cashless society example, so there are actually a lawsuit, I believe, in one in the city of San Francisco, because if you're cashless, homeless people can't buy food, which is
Yep.
a huge problem. But also, I think something that a lot of banks or a lot of these consumer companies did not think about until the CrowdStrike attack or the CrowdStrike outage is, okay, great. Well, if you were cashless all before and CrowdStrike, your one vendor goes down, then you're just out of luck
Mm. Yep.
for days on end. So thinking about that manual plan B, something that we've always done with the military, which has been very hesitant to adopt AI even like 10 years ago, because it was always like, well, what if there's no internet or something happens? And does that mean that my soldier is just going to be neglected on the battlefield and left to die? Like, we need to have contingencies that are manual.
If you don't mind me asking, because we've touched on it, but we haven't gone into it in any depth, data privacy. We're living in an age now where our information is not ours. It's just bought, sold, stolen in many cases, and passed on to third parties without our permission. As technology becomes more sophisticated and as our level of ignorance about AI continues, I'm not sure whether we'll ever get to that utopian state where the education processes and the powers that be give us the necessary knowledge to navigate our way through all of this. So I'm assuming that everything will stay as it currently is, but with more technology coming down the pipeline at us. How is this going to actually help or hinder our concerns with regard to data privacy? Can we see AI as a tool for good in this manner? Or is everything really in the hands of black marketeers and ne'er-do-wells out in the community who just like to muck around and cash in on, on what they can, on what they can?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely use AI to scrub your activities offline and things like that, right? And like, I actually have my own script that I wrote to do precisely that. So everything gets essentially scrapped away every 2 weeks. There is a lot of inconvenience that comes as a part of that, which is that I have to constantly sign into different accounts. But that's just a cost I'm willing to pay, but not a lot of people would. So AI can definitely be used to like protect your own stuff, or even to use AI to detect when your activities and your information have been sold on the black market. That has also been very helpful for a lot of the people that we work with. Um, but I think ultimately, though, with the with the Gen Zers and Gen Alpha, right? I think their default view is that my data is going to be out there and it's going to be public. So it's a very different way for them to look at it, because for them the default is it's going to be out in public. So there might be more of a mind game that they have to play with themselves to be like, oh, but you know what? That should be my right. I'm not sure if they're thinking about it that way.
So effectively, we're living in a post-privacy environment, at least a post-privacy environment as we once understood that to be.
Yes,
And there's no going back.
it would be very hard.
Okay, final two questions. Ivana, can you share a key moment or breakthrough in AI technology that you believe best exemplifies its potential to revolutionize or disrupt society? And what lessons can we draw from this to navigate the future of AI responsibly?
Um, it's not exactly AI, but I'm sure actually now a part of it is. But when it originally started, there was not any AI in it, which is Wikipedia.
Yep.
And I love the example of Wikipedia because people said it couldn't be done, that people would, volunteer their time to write up encyclopedic pages online, and people would use it for disinformation, all these things. And while some of it is true, the majority of the stuff on Wikipedia is right, and everyone is using it now, and it's considered like a semi credible source, right? To at least jumpstart your search. And the way that, so the Wikipedia team, which technically, so Wikipedia is owned by a nonprofit, and they only have, it's a very, very small team that they have, but they do a great job in um regulating and moderating content while allowing for clearly very, very different topics and views to be in there, and what they consider as neutral, right, on a page. um and they use a lot of automation and AI to obviously flag things and do all of that. And so I've always been amazed by how far Wikipedia has come. And it wasn't, I was in what, middle school in the early 2000s, very, very early 2000s. Back then, we were told to never ever use Wikipedia and never cite Wikipedia as a data source. And now, but now, everyone is using and citing Wikipedia in even academic publications.
Ivana, final question. Futurist Ray Kurzweil has predicted that we will reach a technological singularity by 2045, a point where artificial intelligence will surpass human intelligence, leading to unprecedented technological growth. Can you share your thoughts on Kurzweil's prediction and how close do you think we are to reaching this singularity?
I think it all depends on whether or not we regulate it, just like how we have potential of um, creating new nuclear weapons. We can keep on on iterating on computers. I actually don't think. I think 20. You said 2045.
Mhm.
I
Yes.
actually think that's like way, way too far out in terms of our ability to reach singularity, especially with quantum computing um, becoming available commercially in the next 5 to 10 years. I actually don't think it's going to take that long. But just because you have the ability to create something, it does not mean that we should create it or that we should let it out of regulatory bodies. And here I'm obviously equating it to nuclear weapons.
I was going to say something about quantum computing and the likelihood of artificial intelligence becoming sentient. But I think we'll leave that
Yes.
for a future podcast because I think it deserves its own podcast for that. Evanna Hu, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
From Washington, D.C., that was CEO of Omelis and non resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Evanna Hu. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, and for today's episode with Evanna Hu. To learn more about Evanna and connect with her on social media, check out the links in our show notes. Share your insights on AI's impact in the comments section and explore related videos on our channel for a deeper dive into the world of AI. Links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Have comments or questions about the podcast? Drop them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.